Have you ever wondered what's more important, the joke or the way it's delivered? Now, this is one of those questions that was buzzing around my head for a while, so I thought about it, and eventually I came up with my answer. The text of the joke has a fixed value, whereas it is the way it is delivered that brings out the beauty and the humor of the joke. Similarly, it is the way content is presented that brings out the impact that that content could have to offer, and the content could be anything. A speech, an idea, a personality even. Think about it. There are some people, when they walk into a room, people stop and stare. When they speak, people listen. And when they have an idea, somehow they manage to gather support for that idea. And the big question is, how do they do this? There are two simple reasons. The first, quality. They actually have something interesting to say and genuinely good ideas. And the second is they know how to present those ideas so that they can maximize the impact. Now, let me say that quality is very important, but the presentation is what brings out the impact of any good idea. And that's what I'm trying to talk about here. So this whole concept of presentation, I first thought of it when I was at Harvard Model United Nations India 2013. I was in a committee with close to 400 delegates, and for some reason, all these delegates had very similar ideas. On top of that, we were in a competitive environment where every delegate wanted to do well and move the committee forward. In the days leading up to the conference, I wondered what would set the delegates apart. And I thought about it, and eventually it hit me. The skill that would differentiate the delegates would be the delegate's ability to present his or her ideas to the committee. Present not only his ideas, but also the personality as well as the thought process behind those ideas. And the skill of presentation would be the tiebreaker. Now, when I think about people who present well, the world's leaders come to mind. They somehow have an ability to make people listen to them, to convince people about their ideas, to present content well. And I was convinced that this was something that was a natural gift. Well, I was wrong. And the School of Eton actually highlights how this art of presentation is cultivated. A quick backstory. Eton is one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. And it has produced 19 of Britain's prime ministers. And Eton also has a very prestigious scholarship called the King's Scholarship. Boris Johnson is the recipient of this scholarship, just a fun fact. A few years ago, on this examination for the King's Scholarship, there was a question that sparked controversy. The question's up on the projector, but it began with an excerpt from Machiavelli's The Prince. And then the question asked the student to fill the shoes of the British Prime Minister and draft a speech justifying an army shooting. Now, when I first read this question, it made me realize how boring creative writing in India can be. But it also raised another important question. What was Eton trying to achieve with this sort of a question? Well, Eton was trying to cultivate in its potential leaders the art of presentation. For a major part of leadership is the ability to present any viewpoint, even one that might be morally questionable. And that's exactly what Eton was trying to do. Now that I've gone into presentation and what it is, I want to share a few tips that will help people present any content effectively. Now, I learned these tips mainly through public speaking, but they can be applied to other fields as well. The first, know your audience. Now, this is essential. Whenever you're presenting content to anybody, it's important that you understand who your audience is. Whenever I'm in any public speaking event, I try to understand who my judges are. What makes them tick? Will they appreciate my humor? What areas are they experts in? And so forth. And then if I can get an understanding of this information, I try to factor that into my presentation. Now, it's also important to note that sometimes if you don't know your audience, even a great idea can not have the desired impact. I'm going to quote a historical example of Machiavelli. He was the top diplomat in Italy, and when his government was overthrown, he was subject to torture and was sent into exile. Now, a sympathetic government was later restored to power, and Machiavelli wanted his job as a diplomat back. So the ruler at the time was Lorenzo de' Medici, and Machiavelli decided to submit his book, the controversial The Prince, to Medici as a symbol of his humility, as well as a sign of his political competence. But it's almost ironic how a cunning strategy like Machiavelli gets this so wrong. For you see, ladies and gentlemen, Lorenzo de' Medici was near illiterate, and Machiavelli gave him a book. It shows that even a great idea or great competence that Machiavelli had to offer fell on deaf ears. The second tip is make sure what you say can't be interpreted in multiple ways. Everything a person does or says is subject to interpretation. But it's important that the presenter understands and thinks about the different ways something can be interpreted in and try to avoid ones which are grotesque deviations from his intentions. There's a funny, almost lame joke that talks about this. There's a person who's trying to dissuade teenagers from drinking alcohol. So he comes up with this unscientific experiment. It's a joke, mind you. He takes a glass and fills it with water. He takes another glass and fills it with vodka. He drops a worm in both the glasses. The worm in the water lives, whereas the worm in the vodka dies. What are the conclusions that a person could make from this sort of experiment? Well, you could say that alcohol kills, whereas the children came up with this conclusion that if you drink alcohol, you will be free from stomach worms. It's a bad joke, but it shows how grossly content can be misinterpreted. And the last tip on my list is charisma. Now, I'm only going to touch upon charisma because as an area of study, it is very scientific. But if you think about it practically, we interact with charismatic people every day. Now, charisma is simply defined as a sort of compelling charm or attractiveness that a person has. And charisma is determined by every little thing about them, the way they talk, the way they move their hands, their body language, the tone of their voice even. Now, the tone of their voice is something I want to elaborate a bit. Studies have shown that people tend to vote for male politicians who have deeper, richer voices, simply because a deep, rich voice is associated with power. The study showed that almost 70% of potential voters voted for the candidate with a deeper voice when they were shown voice clippings. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Well, that's not me. I don't have a deep voice. I sound like Elmo. But it's interesting. Leaders at the top level have actually taken an effort to change the tone of their voice so that what they said had more of an impact. The best example of this is Margaret Thatcher, Britain's Iron Lady. Margaret Thatcher had a slightly interesting habit. When she was in Parliament and she got excited, her voice became a bit shrill. And she actually took elocution lessons to make her voice a little bit deeper so that when she spoke, she had an impact. And that's how charisma can change the impact of any content. Lastly, I just want everyone to think about this. If they're in a world where people could present content more effectively, their ideas would have more impact. They would be able to touch more people's lives. And if that could be the case, then this is an idea worth spreading. Thank you.